Our first speaker is Mr. Steve Sweeney, and Steve will talk about Hasankeyf and the cultural genocide of Kurds. Steve is the international editor of the Morning Star newspaper and writes extensively on Turkey and Kurdistan. For those who don't know, Morning Star is a socialist newspaper in the UK. He last visited Hasankeyf in 2017 and was detained shortly afterwards in Cizre. Steve has reported from a number of trials, including those of HDP politicians, Selahattin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdağ, and is currently working on a book highlighting women political prisoners held in Turkish jails. So there is some background noise. Can we make sure that it's cut off, please? He founded the Journalists for Democracy in Turkey and Kurdistan initiative last year, is a patron of Peace in Kurdistan, executive member of the Kurdistan Solidarity Campaign. And Steve is currently banned from Turkey as a national security threat after being jailed while trying to enter the country during last year's local elections. It's, I think, because Erdogan doesn't like reading what Steve writes, rather than Steve being a threat. Now, over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much. It's a great honour and privilege to have been invited to come and speak at this meeting. First of all, quite clearly, I'm not an academic. I'd just like to underline that. So you'll probably hear some much more erudite and scholarly interventions from the following speakers. And secondly, I'm also not a Kurd. But I always say this at every meeting I speak at, and I'm very honoured to come and speak at a lot of these kind of meetings. But I always say that, in the words of my good friend Osman Baydemir, I always say that Kurdistan is in my heart. As was said, I was lucky enough to have visited Hasankeyf back in 2017. This was shortly after the constitutional referendum that was held in dubious circumstances, shall we say. And I was detained shortly after as I made my way to Cizre after visiting Hasankeyf. And it was quite striking, really, because it was around the same time, I think, that I visited that a French photographer was jailed. He was taking photographs of the area for the National Geographic magazine, obviously an internationally known publication, and he was there taking nature photographs and photographs of the area. So I thought there was a bit of a parallel, really, because I was going to Cizre for something completely different. I was going to meet with the relatives of those that had been killed in the basement fires in the city. But just as the authorities didn't want me to go and see the crimes that were being committed in Cizre, they tried to stop a nature photographer from capturing what was left then of Hasankeyf before it was plunged underwater. I think a good starting point actually is not even Hasankeyf necessarily, but just to look at what's happening now with the Hagia Sophia, which is quite rightly in the eyes of the world at the moment, and the significance of what this means. And as most people will know, this was it was made a museum by Ataturk, and Erdogan has now changed its use and changed it back into a mosque. And this signifies a number of things, I think, anyway. Personally, I think it was him, a renewed show of strength by Erdogan, appealing to his Islamist base. This is in a smokescreen for a tanking economy, and of course in Istanbul he lost the support of his conservative base, even in Istanbul during last year's election, which of course AKP lost to Ekrem İmamoğlu in what was a humiliating defeat for Erdogan. But also it was him positioning himself and positioning Turkey as a Muslim country, and saying that this is an Islamic country and there's no place here for people that are non-Sunni Sunni Muslims. So there's no place for Christians, Assyrians, there's no place for Jews, there's no place for Alevis, and of course there's no place for Kurds. So this is kind of links in with part of a broader cultural genocide, which is what we're seeing again with Hasankeyf. As we've seen the photographs and we heard in the introduction, Hasankeyf is 12,000 years old, or has been inhabited, sorry, for 12,000 years, and has this symbol of culture spanning across nine centuries. I think we saw in video footage of the caves being blown up and demolished, dynamite that was placed there. And this, I remember seeing this for the first time and thinking this was quite a symbolic moment. And what it reminded me of was the destruction of Palmyra in Syria by ISIS, and of course what we saw there was the jihadists. They said they justified it ideologically. They said that this was in the tradition of Sunni Islam, and it was about the destruction of non-Islamic heritage, and against polytheism and adherence to their kind of narrow, their sort of very narrow kind of view. And I think the similarities were not just visually in terms of what we could see, but I think you can also, and I would also argue that Erdogan's destruction of Hasankeyf is also ideological in its basis. And I say Erdogan because it's him that is now driving this very clearly. As we heard in the introduction, the funding sources from the World Bank, from Switzerland, from Austria have they drained away because they didn't extend the credits to build the Ilisu Dam because of the just clear environmental destruction and cultural destruction and damage that it was creating. Even Balfour Beatty they pulled out, and they're not exactly known for being a company with high regard for morals and ethics. And those of you who don't know, it's worth checking out their role in the Consulting Association and the blacklisting of workers in this country for raising health and safety concerns. So they don't really have any scruples. So for them to pull out of the construction of the dam, it must have been pretty bad. So we can look at the term cultural genocide, and this was a term that I use when I write about Hasankeyf. And what is cultural genocide? What does it mean? It's it's a term that was coined by Raphael Lemkin, the lawyer, back in, I think he coined the term cultural genocide back in 1944. For those of you that don't know, he was the lawyer really that developed the concept of genocide. No such word existed before before he pressed for it, and it was finally adopted by the United Nations. But he developed it in relation to the atrocities that were committed during what is now known as the Armenian genocide, the systematic extermination of 1.5 million men, women, and children by the Ottoman Empire. And so I think it's an appropriate use of that term to describe what is happening now. Again, what cultural genocide, the definition of cultural genocide, and I've written it down here, is acts and measures undertaken to destroy nations or ethnic groups' culture through spiritual, national, and cultural destruction. And I think what's happened in Hasankeyf actually fits that description very well. And we've seen the digging up of tombs, the Zenel Bey tomb, which I think they moved to New Hasankeyf, but of course digging it up along the way. Mosques, tombs, churches have all been destroyed or flooded underneath the water. 80,000 people, I'm not sure, I think this is the accurate figure, are displaced in an area that was previously subjected to forced assimilation. And of course in Kurdistan, in the southeast of Turkey, we know that during the 1990s 3,000 villages were burned to the ground in a forced assimilation project. So I think it's fairly undeniable to say that this is cultural genocide. And while we've seen they'll hide behind this water project, and say that it's desperately needed as a source of energy. But of course, Erdogan is not using it as a source, merely as a source of energy. It is being used to flood out the Kurdish population there, and also to control water supply, which I'm sure others are going to speak about, particularly controlling water supply in Rojava, in northern Syria, and of course in Iraqi Kurdistan. So this is also weaponizing the use of water. But we saw, again, I wrote about this, I think, last month, the destruction of a graveyard in a village just outside of Hasankeyf, in the area that is under discussion now. And this was, again, this is not part of construction work, and you don't send your military into a construction area. And many of you may have seen this already, but they were the Turkish army went in and they just destroyed and desecrated graves. So even in death, there's no peace for the Kurdish people. Not only did they desecrate the graves, but they hung up a Turkish flag from a tree in the graveyard, and of course did the thing that they always do and photographed themselves with this. So this is not merely a construction project. Let's not be fooled into thinking that this is part of the cultural genocide of the Kurds. And this is something that we're seeing. I mean, we've used Hasankeyf as a reference point, but of course it's not just Hasankeyf where we're seeing this is part of a broader project from the Turkish state of a cultural genocide against Kurds, and it's happening, we have to say, under the auspices of the United Nations and of NATO. Turkey is NATO's second largest army. We shouldn't forget that. But one of the first things that I remember, certainly during the Operation Olive Branch last year, in 2018, was we saw the invasion of a peaceful part of northern Syria, Rojava, an area that was home to many people of many different cultures, but of course was largely Kurdish. And one of the first things that I remember was a very symbolic moment that gives the nature of what that invasion was about, was the tearing down of Kava the blacksmith, this statue in the city of Afrin that was torn down and replaced again with Turkish flag. So we see this this happening, allied with jihadists, and forcing 300,000 people out of their homeland and to live in refugee camps and scattered across the country, to be replaced by another population. So this is one of the other features of cultural genocide, is this assimilation and the destruction and tearing down of statues. So this is, Hasankeyf is deeply symbolic of what's happening in terms of a cultural genocide, and it's happening to virtual silence across the world, and in fact we can say worse than silence, it's complicity. So, for example, with Hasankeyf in Britain, we know that there's been numerous letters and objections raised through the official channels, through the government, through Parliament. There's been official questions asked, and the campaign again for UNESCO to register Hasankeyf as a World Heritage Site. Now, I can't remember the exact details of this, but my understanding was that it pretty much fulfilled the criteria to be given that status, but for reasons we can speculate about, and I have my ideas about why that is, that campaign failed and was rejected. But this is, what's happening in Hasankeyf is without shadow of a doubt a cultural genocide. It's attack not just on Hasankeyf, not just on Kurds, but it's an attack on humanity and an attack on people's freedom to choose how to live and to practice their culture and traditions. The same thing was said about Britain in Ireland, by the way. This was a cultural genocide when, like the Kurds, the Irish were not allowed to practice their culture, their language, and in Ireland, of course, their religion there was Catholicism, and that was attempted to be stamped out. So we're seeing exactly the same happening inside to Hasankeyf, but we also look at the wider. I mean, I think that the genocide against Kurds is also political as well. So, as was said in the introduction, that I've attended the trials of HDP MPs, and of course we're seeing that as part of a political genocide against Kurds, with the virtual shutting, or the attempts to shut down democracy and the People's Democratic Party, which we saw the democracy marches very recently. But the figures for that are quite, I always find quite shocking, and I always say them to, when British audiences hear this and compare it to social democratic parties in this country, the Labour Party, they're quite astonished. I mean, it's 15,000 HDP activists have been detained since 2015. So 15,000, and I think 6,000 of those have been jailed. 200 of their elected officials, including 7 MPs, remain behind bars. And these are the only people actually that politically are speaking out against what's happening in Hasankeyf too. So they're silencing any kind of internal opposition to anything like this, the cultural genocide of Kurds, the attacks on Hasankeyf. So we have to put it in that context, as well. I mean, I'm probably going to finish with that, really, because I think we're hoping to open it up, I guess, to some discussion and questions. But it always comes back to the things is what we can do about it. And I always like to say there's always a way, and there's always something that people can do, whether that's writing to their MPs or getting involved politically. But I guess we'll come on to that a little bit more in the discussion. But thank you very much.